Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Disaffamy History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. There are journeys we take, and then there are journeys that stay with us long after we've arrived. Across the Caribbean and its diaspora, migration has never just been about movement. It's about what is left behind, who is left behind, and the quiet, enduring question of home. For many, leaving was never meant to be permanent. It was a step towards something, opportunity, survival, a better life. But somewhere along the way, return became uncertain, delayed, or, as today's conversation reminds us, it never happened at all. Never forget home is more than a phrase. It carries the weight of distance, longing, sacrifice, and the emotional realities of migration that stretch across generations. Today we are joined by Professor Wilmoth, who teaches at Indiana University in the School of Education's Department of Urban Teacher Education and Africana Studies program. Her dissertation, Never Forget Home, Constructions of Black Roatán Identity in Roatán, Honduras, explores the formation of Black cultural identity along Central America's Caribbean coast. A central part of her work involved conducting interviews through podcasting, preserving the authentic voices and lived experiences of Roatanian communities, particularly second-generation migrants navigating identity, belonging, and memory. Through her research, Professor Wilmoth brings us closer to understanding how home is not only shaped by geography, but by history, migration, and the stories people carry with them across borders. In this episode, we explore migration, identity, family separation, and the emotional landscapes that define Caribbean and Central American diasporic life. Because sometimes home is not just a place you return to, it's a place you carry even when you never make it back. So let's have a listen. From your research, how do Black Roatanians understand and define their Black identity, especially within a Honduran national context that often centers on mestizo narratives?
Yeah, so this is very complex. As just to give a little background, Honduras as a nation state has a very complex history as much as Latin America. I always say that the colonizers got too greedy and they started to create these systems that they really could not keep up. And so, particularly Black Britannians, they kind of construct their identity, their Afro kind of like Caribbean identity through several different like waves. And through my research, I found that they found their identity through linguistic traditions, specifically um, being Afro-Caribbean migrating to particularly Rattan, that indigenous kind of English linguistics have always kind of stayed within Black Britannians, also kind of like their religious life, very Protestant, a Methodist. Later on waves, there are like Pentecostal, Seventh-day Adventists, very religious life, but also their kinship networks as they're tied to like this Caribbean migration. So in the context of like mestizaje or mestizo, it basically disrupts the very line of having multiple layers to their identity, and that their identity is not necessarily a gender-based identity
Mm,
or a race-based identity, but more so historically, it's a cultural identity that kind of transcends outside of the boundary lines of a space like Honduras. So it not only is personal, but it's
mm,
cultural.
yeah. And then, going back to that, you outlined two major waves of Black migration to Roatan. Can you just walk us through these waves, like who was arriving from where, and of course, under what type of circumstances?
Yeah, so there's one like I say very common narrative around rattan or the migration of Black people, and that's that one wave from St. Vincent's and the Grenadines, which is the Garifuna
Hmm.
people who migrated, who got exiled actually out of St. Vincent's and the Grenadines and got deported around like the late 19th, the 1797.
Hmm.
I always get those dates
Yeah.
wrong, but the late 17th century, um, where again, when the colonization started to happen in these smaller islands, and these Yoruba boats, I always say like enslaved Africans, particularly Yoruba and Igbo people from West Africa who have maroon blood inside of them started to create rebellions. They did not want to be a part of what was happening. And so, because of that, they kicked them out of their own country. And they end up finding that coastal line of Ratan, which is specifically Punta Gorda, which is where, for Ratanian or for Ratan in its space, is where that first wave of like Black indigenous, kind of like this Caribbean way of like the first people coming into that wave. But later on in like the 18th century, probably around, I want to say 1830s, when
Mm.
we have something like the Slave Act in the Caribbean, where freedom, some type of freedom was happening, where we had people from Jamaica and the Cayman Islands who started to migrate into particular other islands based off of fishing, trade, um, I'm trying to think of like economic autonomy. And they ended up in spaces like Rattan. So I have both sides of
Mm.
my family who have that kind of wave where we have this one wave from my great grandfather's side who were kind of on that St. Vincent's and the Grenadine kind of, but also Grenada, who kind of ended up on the coastal lines of the mainland of Honduras. But then on my grandmother's side, I have more of the Cayman, Jamaican migration of the first people that I can actually look back into like 1858 from the Cayman Islands who came to Rattan. So
That's really great. And of course, how did, I guess, with the second generation born in Roatan experience, of course, identity differently from their parents, particularly belonging around language and cultural retention?
yeah, that's a complex question. But it's a deep question. Thinking about second generations like my father um who grew up, was raised and born and raised in Rattan. When I was doing my research, some of the things that I started to uncover was that Honduras started to make um these policies regarding linguistic language. So, for instance, Black people in Rattan historically spoke English, but then as Honduras as a nation state started to put in mandate that you had to speak Spanish and started using language as a way to oppress people, um, those were some of the things that kind of disrupted that second generation. I can say just for my family, I think because my family always talk, and I think particularly my grandmother, can't speak for my whole entire family, but my grandmother was one of those people who spoke with her son, which was my dad, about the importance of her heritage, who they were. He had such a pride growing up, but I know that that conversation was not necessarily being had where most children just had to go to school, behave, learn Spanish, go home, and then the parents would reinforce what the teachers were doing in the classroom as well. So there was some levels in my studies that I found like corporal punishment was one of those things that started to slowly erase Black identity formation. When I had conversations with my participants about, do you know anything about your history? Do you know anything about your Black history? There was little tenets here and there, but it was never necessarily taught in the classroom. Either somebody in your family had to teach that to you, or you had to find books. But that whole idea about Black identity, second generation, really got disrupted in schooling. But there is some research that I did find that there was only like one church that really kind of stuck to that. And it was like more of like the Methodist church who was able to maintain kind of like those Black historical records of what that looked like for second generation communities.
Well, it's just very interesting how, certain repositories will have information while others will not, in terms of being able to, and even in trying to be able to piece those all together, which makes a challenge, I guess. And what role has the Honduran government played in shaping, recognizing, or at times just limiting the visibility and the rights of the Black Roatán community?
So one of the things that Honduras they play a very political game. At some parts, they have acknowledged the Garifuna Black people from a UNESCO standpoint of like preserving the mestizos, the very indigenous folks and indigenous populations. But when it comes down to like Black people in Rattan, it was just now in 2024 that Congress actually passed a month to have identified for Black English speaking people of Rattan. And we now have a Heritage Month, who that was led by a activist named Jareen Grant in
Mm-hmm.
Rattan. But that preservation still is a struggle because it's one thing to be recognized, but it's another thing to actually have funding to support the effort so that the preservation can continue to happen. And so what happens oftentimes is that in my own personal like research and just understanding race is
Mm-hmm.
that it's easier to put people on a platform to say we're sick and tired of hearing them fighting over what we don't want them to be. And this kind of goes back to eugenics movement. This kind of goes back to colonization, is that the darker you are, the more rebellion you are, the lower that you're going to be. And we might do something for you so that you can be quiet. And so what I often just continue to just see is that Black Britannians or Bay Island Creole people, while are very visible, also struggle to maintain that fight and that continuity. It's like one minute we'll have a conversation about what does it mean to preserve, and we'll get halfway there. And then something else happens, and then you get 2 years behind and then you
Mm-hmm.
come back in waves. And so it's just the consistency, not necessarily on the people, the Black people of Rattan, but it's also the inconsistencies of Honduras playing this political game of like, oh, we want to preserve you based off of tourism. Because guess what? We need you so that when people get off these boats, they can see like, oh, there might be some exotic folks who live in this land. Or, but we also know that these same Black people are working entirely hard and are laboring behind this very nation state. Honduras would not be Honduras without the contributions of Black Britannian people, hands down.
Absolutely. And I guess we're just going to go that kind of digress into the documents and the archives. So, how have families preserved important documents like birth records, land records, letters, And, what role, if any, has the government played in supporting or hindering this preservation?
hmm So, majority of Black Britannian people, I always say Black Creole people because we'll get back into identity a little later, but um, majority is through storytelling.
Mm,
Because as Black diaspora people and African people, we tell stories. We maintain those stories, but we also know that those stories can be embellished based off of trauma, based off of where we're at that certain time. We might add a little bit more embellishment to the story. And so, what has been difficult in some ways is because most people keep their documents, obituaries, or deeds underneath their blanket or in a little cubby hole somewhere in the house or in a chifforobe, like, a old dining room cabinet or stuck between a mirror. Um, I've in Bibles,
mm,
in random spaces that you don't even know where they're located. Um, And it's very interesting because, particularly in Rattan, there has not been a space
mm,
where you could go to submit these documents outside of like deeds or political pieces of
mhm,
paper like that. But majority of the time, like I know, for instance, like my aunt used to carry, she had her birth certificate like laminated and was carrying it around. And we went to somewhere she needed some paperwork being done, and she had these big. She's a little short little lady, but she had these big old documents laminated, like double, triple laminated. And I'm like, what is this? And she's like, oh, this is my birth certificate. This is blah blah blah. This is the deed to X, Y, and Z. And so majority of the time that we're looking for this is either a story that we've heard, documentation that has been hidden underneath a mattress, and, it could be that somebody slid something behind a piece of wood,
yeah,
and so happen it just falls into your lap. And you're like, what is this? That's majority of where the documents that we have found so far
mm.
in
And
preservation
okay,
materials.
no
Yeah.
problem. Like I know that you in your article in your paper you discussed, families maintaining these family Bibles. And, how do these objects function as informal archives? And why are they so important for preserving identity and lineage?
Yeah, I've just been truly blessed to have had, I think, my grandmother, who was just really loving and cared about her family unit, that she was able to keep her mother's Bible. And she often wrote in her Bible. I never had a chance to meet my grandmother,
Mhm.
but I met her through just her writing and whatever she left with my dad. And so, it's just so important that we write our stories now. I am like an advocate of like writing your bio, tell somebody something. Like majority of the time we have a couple of elders that are left in my family, and I just kind of press record like in the middle of a conversation. I just hurry up and just press record now that we have that. But it's just so important because for the next generation, they really just need to know like where they come from. Why do they do the things that they do? Why do you have these little subtle things that you, in your own personal identity? Like, why do you get chills? Like for me, I get chills when I see like particular like pictures and Bibles, and because she wrote everything. She wrote our family tree. I was able to find like all of my aunts and uncles. My dad knew everybody's name. He knew how many children each person had. He knew the children by name because he also just had an interest in it. But also what had been an amazing thing is that my grandmother had this emblem of like the Honduras kind of like creed, and she would carry it everywhere she went. And to this day, we still have that. My dad still has that in the house. She would never, when she moved, she never let anybody touch it. She would wrap it up in a blanket herself.
Mm.
And so just recently, I was able to just uncover that Bible because my father was in the military at one point and he kept a lot of his records. And then there was the Bible. And so when we went through the Bible, oh boy, it had ledgers and it had midwife information and had births of people who were born all the way from like the early 19th century. And I've been trying to like go through the names and ask people, is this your great grandparents? Who are these folks? Where do they come from? And it tells you the night, the day, in between, the complications. And it's just so helpful, especially because Honduras has a census record. Rattan does not have a census record.
Okay. Wow. And then, of course, we're going to go back to now the storytelling. Beyond, of course, the written records, how do storytelling, memory, and of course, oral traditions help sustain Black Rotan history across the generations?
Yeah, it's just so important again, like
Mhm.
memory, one thing for African people and African diaspora people, memory is the powerful tool that we always have had. Because if they erase, we remember. And
Mhm.
so one thing that I always make sure to pay attention to is like it's so important that I'm listening to the stories of the elders of the community that are still left, or the next generation that, like my dad's generation, of how he grew up, who were the people that he was talking to, because what that could do is if we find someone else who have documents, we can kind of go back and say, "Oh, I remember when I had a conversation with Isabella, and I remember when I had a conversation with Pastor Brooks, and when I had a conversation with Pastor Brooks, he said a name X, Y, and Z, and I can go back and look and say, "Oh, yes, that's exactly who this person is." But one thing that I think too with memory that's often lost, and I think is a very challenging when you are a come from a storytelling creed of people. Again, you're only being able to hear the story. You don't have the material, you don't have the physical flesh of the person. And it's sometimes hard because your imagination, I'm one of those people who have like an imagination. My imagination goes rampant. And I just think about the time period. I think about, I have to use historical references of what's going on in Honduras, what happened during this time to make sense on why something like this could possibly show up. And so I believe that there has been a lot of history that has been lost
Mhm.
because trauma plays a part of it. You know, I know that a lot of folks come from a silent generation. A lot of folks did not have, they were like, no, we're not going to tell our stories because it was too dangerous to do it. Because again, if you say too much, we don't know who's FBI. We don't know who's working for the CIA. We don't know who these folks are working for that we could get kidnapped, we could get killed, our families could be taken away. Those are some of the real realities that I think about oftentimes, but I'm always like, man, I wish I could go back into time and say, just stop. Can we just interview you for 1 minute?
Yeah, that whole time traveling situation would be great. And now, while, with language, particularly English, Creole, and of course other local linguistic forms, is so central to the Black Roatan identity.
So when we think about like language preservation, the English and Creole, like it's like a signature sign of like historical relationship, which is interesting, the historical relationship with like the British and the Caribbean. And
Mhm.
it serves as like this marker of like cultural autonomy, whereas oftentimes it can it it can be one of those things that not only operate as communication, but like historical evidence, like the diaspora is still connected. Um, and the reason why I say that is that creolization is one of those things that evolve over time. Particularly in Rattan, there had been multiple waves of like colonization. So the English colonized, you had some, Spanish colonization. And so when you have all those different things kind of mixing together, um, Black people, and particularly in Rattan, are just trying to maintain what's going to be best for them to navigate. And I know one of the biggest things I do know is that when I was growing up, my father used to always be like, the Spaniards, the Spaniards, the Spaniards. And I'd be like, why does he keep saying that? I'm like, why does he continue to say that? As I started doing my research, I started to realize like the Spanish conquest of linguistic language was a deterioration to the entire Bay Island of Honduras. Like, folks did not want the Spanish people of Honduras to tear them apart, and they thought that maintaining their English was the closest thing to like Africa, to their identity. But as you know, when linguistics starts to happen, there are folks to this day who don't, and people in Rattan who don't know Spanish. They are English speakers, but then they had to be taught to speak Spanish to navigate. And so having to force an entire nation state of people who have been doing what they've been doing, minding their business, fishing,
Yeah.
having a beautiful community, and then all of a sudden, because of the issues that have been going on in Honduras, the Spanish people started to move out and say, "Oh, they got free fish. They got these free fruits and vegetables. They don't have to worry about X, Y, and Z." And so that's later on it shows up where Black Rotanians they start to struggle with their identity because of that very line of not maintaining their true essence of who they are based off of the force colonization of
Mhm.
Honduras. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, just to still go on that theme is how have then Roatan communities resisted that loss in terms of the language, it being either lost or being marginalized?
Yeah, they have been fighting since day one. Like they've been fighting to want to be identified. They want people to know who they are as Black people, that they were the first one. They were the surveyors. They were the cultivators. They were the ones who created the tourism industry. They were the ones who cared for their children. And so now, it has caused an issue where folks are forgetting there's this identity clash where some people want to just be Black because it sounds good, and they're Black, but they don't want to be called Black because that means that you're damned, like you're less than if you say that. Then there's this hybrid of like I'm Bay Island Creole
Mm,
English speaker where I don't want to be called Afro-Latin because Latin or Spanish anything disrupts the very line of my true Blackness.
yeah.
Whereas you have now this generation who has migrated to the United States because people till this day don't believe that Black people live in Honduras, let alone they don't even know Rattan. And if
Mhm.
you know people who know about Rattan, is either through tourism or somebody randomly, a missionary randomly went there, or somebody did some type of missionary work for a couple of days, but they really just don't know the true essence. And so what I found is that Black Britannians struggle depending on which day it is. It's like one time I want to identify and I want to know my Blackness, but I don't know where it starts at. I don't know where the beginning of my Blackness starts. Whereas you have some people who say, yeah, I'm Black and I'm proud, but I'm also in Honduras but I want a Spanish husband and I have Spanish kids. And then when you come to the United States, because of this racial hierarchy and this caste system of trying to identify something, like I know there's probably so many people from Rattan who had migrated to the United States, but because they had to check off Black
Yes.
and without ethnicity, we would never know until we have to kind of go back, ask questions, look at things and say, okay, potentially this person in New Orleans probably is from Rattan, but we can identify them because, and I know oftentimes in my dissertation, that was one of the biggest struggles. Some people said they're Honduran. Some people said they were Afro-Honduran. Some people was like, absolutely not. I'm not calling myself Afro-Latin. Um, some folks was like, I'm Ratanian. Some folks was like, I'm Black Creole Indigenous. So
It was very, um, so what would you say in regards to, I guess, with the banana trade? Like, what was the impact of that banana trade on the Black communities in Roatan, economically, socially, and of course, in terms of migration and displacement?
yeah, so the banana trades didn't really impact Rattan too much. That was more on the mainland, like in the coastal region of Honduras. However, we know that it shaped the migration labors, like it reshaped the labor and the patterns of like migration flow. So, which kind of disrupted again Honduras once again once you start having people coming from different countries into the nationality or this space where they're trying to say, hey, yep, I'm Jamaican, I'm in Honduras, now I want to be a Honduras citizen. That very line starts to create this like fractured mixture of national unity. And so what has happened is that a lot of people from the Caribbean who came over to work in those banana zones said, "Hey, I want my reparations. I'm not going back to Jamaica. I'm not going back to the Cayman Islands. I'm not going back to Barbados. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to live here." And so what was happening, people like Carreras, who was one of the presidents of Honduras, like really put these mandates and to like try to exile folks, was killing people. Like my uncle was basically telling me like there were times where he was exiling, really kicking people out, killing folks, going through this whole ransack. But you have to think like if you've labored in an industry that is 10 times worse, I can say, than like plantation cotton was hard work. But fruit labor was a whole nother beast that we don't talk about often, about the harsh conditions and the living and the wages and things of that nature. And most of them did not get money. That's when that started to really have a huge impact because most of the people from Jamaica, Barbados, the Caribbean who came over to work was like, I want to become a Honduran citizen.
Mhm,
And they were
mhm.
trying to ship them back to their countries. People
Oh,
is like, absolutely not.
yeah. And I guess with that, with the racial mixing in terms of shaping the Black Rotan community, did this create like tensions or divisions within and around the community as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to that racial mixing caste system, Mehisaje, where it's just like, okay, if you have a child with a Spanish person, they had I always keep this chart from back in the 16th century where, the Portuguese came up with this idea of like, hey, if you have a child by this person, this is what your child's going to look like. And so I always say it backfired. Blackness is dominant. Blackness will always be like it is amazing. But what happened is that in places like Honduras, again, it Afro descendant communities always maintained. Like you couldn't do anything. So of course, if you're lower in the lower caste system, again, you are considered less than. So the struggle of homes and trying to maintain land, um, the casting out, the moving around. Um, but one thing I can say is that Virginian people are very resilient people. Like
Mhm.
they will find a way,
Yeah.
always. And I think that's what diaspora people like. When we get knocked down and they said that we can't, we're going to find some materials and we're going to do it. And we're going to make a nation within a nation, regardless if they even identify us or not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always the same. And then, of course, I guess with the connection to the greater Caribbean, like how are, Black Rotan communities connected to the Caribbean world and culturally, historically, and of course through this whole migration network?
So, unfortunately, I can say just from research and just thinking and just being around and observing is that rattan is still outside of this pocket of the Caribbean. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're often not considered, particularly, I'll say, Bay Islanders are not always considered a part of the Caribbean. Um, Garifuna people are always the prioritized conversation. There's multiple articles, there's multiple books, there's so much research out here regarding the Garifuna and how they've migrated from, Rattan to New York to Florida and creating their spots. But recently, between me, um, Zenoli Grant, who live in the United States, have been probably the only scholars so far that have been really working very hard to map out those migrations because it had not, there's rarely any.
Mm-hmm.
So for when I, growing up, I just know that when we tried to go to the African Caribbean festivals or when we tried to be around, like we were in a Honduras flag, they're like, what? You're California? We're like, no, we're Rattan, we're from Rattan. And they're like, where is that at? And Rattan to this day is still one of those islands that are not considered a priority, which is sad to me because it has such a wealth of beauty and storytelling and resilience and love and care. And for an island that can fit in, we call here in the Lucas Oil Stadium, which is like the biggest stadium for the Colts, for that island to fit into that stadium. That's how small the island is, but it's so powerful because there's so much stories and resilience that we could learn from those migrations, but we often don't hear anything about Rattan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's always these forgotten stories that are just not really told or even discussed. And, you know, Professor Wilmoth, could you just be able to share, I guess, the story behind the title, Never Forget Home of your research, and why it best captures the heart of your research?
Yeah, so growing up, my father was always one of those people who used to tell us and tell my siblings and I, like, never forget where you come from. Just never forget. And he always used to instill with us, even though I was born in America, you would have thought I was Britannian, like for real, for real. Um, but growing up, he always said, he used to just tell us stories from our family. We was always around my aunts. We called them the Magnificent Seven. We was always around my aunts. We was always around our family. If there was a cookout, we was there. If we X, Y, and Z, like we were entrenched. We were like, my father just threw it onto us. And so I'll just never forget that when I was growing up and going through school, when we had International Day, I would try to wear a Honduras flag, and people used to think I would be making things up, like there's no such thing as Black people from Honduras. And it used to bother me a lot. I'm like, Dad, this doesn't even make any sense. I almost thought that one day that my dad was making stuff up because it got to the point where it was getting too much in school where I had a teacher who literally said, you know, there's no way your dad is from Honduras. Spanish people are from Honduras. And so as I started to write this dissertation, my dad always wanted to tell his story. And so what I did was I kind of stepped into his shoes and use a little bit of what he used to tell me to like never forget home. And I wrote this not only as like a homage to him, but like a homage to like all of my family members who never really got a chance to really tell the story because I've never found a book. I remember writing my dissertation and how difficult it was to even write this because I had to kind of piece things together to make things make sense. Um, it was a difficult thing, but I'm thankful for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so never forget home is just one of those things. It's like never forget where you come from. And I want everybody, whether you're Caribbean or Black American or X, Y, and Z, like never forget where you're from, where your roots are, who you are. Be proud of everything from the traumas to the joyous moments, but also like waddle in that. And even if you're from like a little small town and you're like the first Black person, like being able to never forget where you come from, because that is the most powerful tool to help us navigate in this life.
No, well said. And, why is it important that the identity of Black Hondurans of Roatan is still remembered and protected? And what happens when that history is erased?
Yeah, it's so important that we maintain these stories as we are working on them. It is hard work. I think that when we erase, we can't get we can't get it back. Once it's gone, it's gone. But I think that someone like me who comes from like the second generation from my father, it's just so important that when I have children or my next generation of my cousins,
Mhm.
that they will have something to lean on, that they can go back into these stories when their times get hard. Because times does get hard, and sometimes you have to read other people's stories to help you move on, whether that's in your career, whether that's in your spiritual world, that's whether in your faith, in what you believe in. Also, it helps with your esteem.
Mhm.
I just think that it's so important for the young generation, particularly in Rattan, have a space now to kind of go, even if we're starting to create new histories, because oftentimes we always look at history as a past thing, but
Mhm.
history is still being written.
Yes.
So there are so many young, talented, um, musicians and artists and rappers and like, storytellers that I don't know anything about that are still in Rattan that are being raised. And so I would love for them to also create an archive where they can start telling a story. What does it mean to be Black Britannian in 2026? What are some of the things that they also have been challenged with for themselves? So it is just so important to not only look to the past, look at the present, but also look at the future. Like this space can be really a space for people to start telling their stories even now. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, finally, Professor Wilmoth, what message would you like to leave the listeners with about identity, memory, and of course, the importance, as you mentioned before, of preserving Black Caribbean histories?
Mhm. I think one of the things that I always, for me particularly, our greatest gift for Black people from the diaspora, is our history and our education.
Mhm.
And we have to get to the point where we cannot allow anyone else to tell our stories. We just cannot. Research violence is a real thing,
Mm,
and I've seen more and more of it coming out where I'm like, where did you get that from?
mm,
But I want people to begin having the courage to tell their stories, be confident, because we we're still dealing with that. Black people look like they're not even considering us human anymore still. Like we still are fighting that same battle throughout the diaspora. Like this is not a United States issue. This is a diasporic
mhm,
thing. And so I want listeners to know that when you know who you are, nothing can stop you. Like when you know who you are, you know how to walk in a room, you know
mm,
what to do, you know how to sustain, you know how to raise your kids, you know how to love and continue to sustain and survive. We need to be able to survive and not survive from being pushed away and
mhm,
erased at 12 years old. Our ancestors lived almost like Caribbean particular lived to be 96 for
yes.
some reason, like years old. They became like 104 because they knew how to preserve, they knew how to maintain. And I want that same for us. I want us to live, and I want our stories to live beyond our physical bodies, that one day when we have to go to rest, that our stories are continued to speak life into the world.
Oh, that is so powerful and so needed to be said because it's right. We have to be the ones to own and to tell our stories. Because for myself, just going into the archives and seeing what I've seen, I'm just like, we've been told, an empty bag that we don't even know that we were told that. So I'm so glad that you said it. So, and I do appreciate that you coming on, Professor Wilmoth, to speak about this, because this is all very important. And as you said, you do walk differently once you know your history, and because it kind of grounds you and it anchors you in so many ways. So thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was such a privilege and an honor.
And so we return, not always to a place, but to a feeling. Because for so many across the Caribbean and its diaspora, home is not just where you are, it is where you remember, where you long for, where pieces of you remain. Never forget home is not just a statement, it is a truth carried quietly across oceans, across generations, across lives lived in between here and there. But even in that distance, home does not disappear. It lives in the stories we tell, in the families we hold close, in the memories we refuse to let go. And maybe getting home is not always about returning, but about remembering, reclaiming, and carrying it forward in new ways. Thank you for listening to Dis FME History Podcast, where our stories live, our voices rise, and our history stays with us. Because this is Fiwi's story.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.